At a family reunion, my aunt hissed, "You're just a nobody. Stop acting like you belong here." But when the hotel manager addressed me as Madam Owner and offered me the penthouse, she clutched her chest in shock as the whole family stared at her in silence. I never liked family reunions. Some people find comfort in them, in the idea of reconnecting with people who share their blood, their history. But for me, they were nothing more than a reminder of where I came from, a place I had fought tooth and nail to escape. The Harringtons were old money, the kind of family that believed status was everything. If you weren't wealthy, successful, or at the very least married to someone you weren't worth much in their eyes. And if you had ever fallen from grace, you might as well have been invisible. That's exactly what happened to me 10 years ago. I was the black sheep, the nobody they had written off without a second thought. So when the invitation arrived for the Grand Harrington family reunion, I should have thrown it away. But I didn't. Instead, I packed my bags and booked my ticket to Charleston, South Carolina, knowing exactly what kind of reception I would get. And God, did it feel good to prove them all wrong. I arrived late on purpose. The Charleston Grand was one of the most prestigious hotels in the area, a stunning 5-star resort with marble floors, grand chandeliers, and staff who treated every guest like royalty. I stepped through the entrance, suitcase in tow, taking in a familiar scent of fresh flowers and expensive perfume. It had been years since I last set foot in Charleston, and yet the moment I walked in, it was like stepping into a battlefield I knew all too well. The first person to spot me was Aunt Margaret. She was standing near the reception desk, a glass of champagne in hand, her posture perfect, as always. Her eyes swept over me like a scanner, assessing every inch of my appearance. "Alice?" she said, her voice laced with disbelief. I gave her a polite nod. "Aunt Margaret." Her lips pursed slightly, as if she had tasted something bitter. "Well, you actually came." I smiled. "Surprised?" She gave a short laugh. "To be quite honest, yes. I didn't think you'd show your face after all these years." I knew what she meant. After my father's death, I had left Charleston with nothing. No inheritance, no family support, just a duffel bag and a broken heart. I had struggled, and they all knew it. To them, I was the failure, the one who had disappeared, never to be heard from again. But they had no idea what had happened since then. Aunt Margaret took a slow sip of her champagne before lowering her voice. "You know, dear, some of us were just saying you never really fit in with the family. Maybe it would have been best if you had just stayed away." I held her gaze. "Is that so?" She smiled, but it wasn't kind. "You're just a nobody, Alice. Stop acting like you belong here." The words stung. Not because they were true, but because they used to be. Before I could respond, a smooth voice cut through the tension. "Miss Harrington," the hotel manager, Mr. Calloway, said warmly. "Welcome back. We prepared the penthouse for you. Everything is in order." Silence. Complete, staggering silence. I felt it happen to shift in the air. Aunt Margaret's face went rigid. Her fingers tightened around her glass, knuckles whitening. Behind her, I could see my other relatives turn, watching, listening, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. I smiled and turned to the manager. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. I appreciate it." He nodded. "Would you like us to send your bags up?" "Madam?" "Madam." The word hung in the air, a declaration, a revelation. Aunt Margaret inhaled sharply. I turned back to her, tilting my head slightly. "Something wrong?" She stared at me. You're staying in the penthouse?" I took the key card from Mr. Calloway's hand. "That's right." The disbelief on her face was almost delicious. "But how?" She whispered. I let the question hang for a moment before replying. "Guess you never really knew me at all." And with that, I walked away, leaving behind a lobby full of stunned, silent family members. The penthouse was exactly as I remembered, spacious, luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. I stepped onto the balcony, the warm breeze brushing against my skin as I stared out at Charleston. It had been 10 years. 10 years since my father's funeral, since my family had cast me aside, since I had nothing. They had no idea what happened after I left. I had worked harder than they ever could have imagined. I had started with nothing, taking whatever jobs I could find just to survive. I had lived in tiny apartments, skipped meals, spent nights wondering if I had made a mistake. But I had learned. Through sheer determination, I had built something of my own. I had clawed my way into the real estate business, flipping properties, making smart investments, outmaneuvering people who thought they were smarter than me. Now I owned hotels, including this one. The Charleston Grand wasn't just a place I was staying. It was mine. And my dear, arrogant relatives had no idea. Yet, dinner was where it all came to a head. The ballroom was grand, filled with candlelight and a low murmur of polite conversation. I arrived fashionably late, just as I had planned. The moment I entered, I felt the shift. People turned to look. Some whispered. Aunt Margaret's eyes flicked to me before quickly looking away. I made my way to my seat, sliding into the chair next to my younger brother, Eric. He leaned in almost immediately. "What the HLL is going on?" he whispered. "You're staying in the penthouse?" I simply smiled. Then Zach, my cousin, stood and cleared his throat. Family, I have an exciting announcement, he said, voice dripping with self-importance. We've been working on acquiring a new luxury resort, one of the finest in Charleston. A true investment in our family's legacy. There were polite nods, murmurs of approval. I set down my fork. Which resort? Zach barely glanced at me. The Charleston Grand. Silence. I tilted my head slightly. That's interesting. Zach smirked. And why is that? I let a slow smile stretch across my lips. Because I already own it. The table went dead silent. Aunt Margaret actually gasped. Zach's face drained of color. Eric choked on his wine. Excuse me? Zach finally said. I leaned back, letting the weight of my words settle over them. You heard me. Aunt Margaret's voice wavered. That's impossible. I arched an eyebrow. Is it? Eric, barely holding back laughter, whispered, oh, this is amazing. I picked up my wine glass, raised it slightly. To family, I said, voice smooth. And as the truth crashed down on them, I took a slow sip, savoring every second. For a long moment, nobody moved. The weight of my words hung in the air, pressing down on the table like an invisible force. I could see it in their faces, the way realization crashed over them, the way their carefully constructed superiority started to crack. Aunt Margaret gripped the stem of her wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. Zach's smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by a stunned, almost panicked expression. Uncle Henry shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between me and Zach, as if waiting for someone to confirm that he had misheard. You. Aunt Margaret's voice came out hoarse. You own this hotel? I took my time, swirling the deep red wine in my glass before answering. Yes. Zach let out a sharp laugh, though it sounded forced. That's ridiculous. You're joking. I simply stared at him. He wasn't used to me being silent. Back when we were younger, I was always the one scrambling to defend myself. Always explaining, always proving. But now I let the silence do the talking. Aunt Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set her glass down. I don't understand, she said, her voice low. How is that even possible? I tilted my head. Because I work for it. She scoffed, but there was a nervousness in her expression. Work for what? You disappeared, Alice. No one knew where you went. And now you expect us to believe you somehow managed to. She stopped, shaking her head in disbelief. Zach regained some of his confidence, straightening his posture. Look, he said, forcing a casual tone. Even if you do have some kind of involvement in this place, it doesn't change the fact that we've been in negotiations to acquire it. So whatever share you have, I suggest you take the payout while you still can. Eric let out a snort of laughter next to me, but I didn't react. I leaned forward slightly. Tell me something, Zach, I said, my voice calm. Who exactly have you been negotiating with? He hesitated. The management team. I smiled. And who do you think they answer to? Realization flickered in his eyes. They answer to me. Aunt Margaret sucked in a breath. Zach, for the first time in his entire life, was speechless. I turned to Uncle Henry. How much money has the family pooled for this acquisition so far? He frowned, still processing what was happening. We've already committed millions into securing an exclusive deal with the board. I let out a soft chuckle. That's unfortunate. Zach narrowed his eyes. Why? I met his gaze and dropped the final beam shell. Because I'm not selling. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Zach shot up from his seat. That's not possible. I stayed perfectly still. Oh, but it is. His hands clenched at his sides. You don't understand how business works, Alice. I sighed. Zach, I own this hotel. The board answers to me. There is no deal. There was never a deal. The color drained from his face. Eric, unable to contain himself any longer, let out a low whistle. Holy SHD. Aunt Margaret's eyes darted between me and Zach, as if trying to piece together the impossible truth. But she stopped herself, struggling to find the right words. You never had anything. I turned to her. Because that's what you all wanted to believe. Silence. I could see it, the way they were rethinking everything. The way they were reevaluating me. For years, they had looked at me with pity, condescension, and dismissal. Now, for the first time, there was something else. Aunt Margaret clenched her jaw, trying to compose herself. You should have told us. I laughed, low and quiet. Told you? I echoed. Told you what exactly? That the girl you all discarded didn't actually fail? That I didn't need any of you to succeed? She flinched at my words. Zach, still too stunned to speak, sank back into his chair, rubbing his temples. Eric, who had been watching the entire thing unfold like a front-row spectator at a drama he never expected to see, leaned in. Please tell me you're going to make them pay for this, he whispered. I didn't answer, but I didn't need to, because this was far from over, and they hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room. The clinking of silverware against fine china had stopped. Conversations had died mid-sentence. The only sounds were the hushed, stunned whispers as my relatives tried to process what just happened. I had spent years being their afterthought, their disappointment, the girl who had failed in their eyes. And now, I was the one holding all the cards. Aunt Margaret sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers gripping the tablecloth as though steadying herself. The muscles in her jaw twitched. She was desperately trying to regain control of the situation, to find a way to make this moment less humiliating. She took a slow breath, smoothing out her expression, and then she forced a polite, tight-lipped smile. "Well," she said lightly, "this is quite the surprise." Eric coughed loudly, barely masking his laughter. Zach, still reeling, finally found his voice. "You can't just waltz in here after 10 years and expect us to believe you suddenly own one of the most prestigious hotels in Charleston." I raised an eyebrow. "Do you think I'm lying?" Zach scoffed, but it wasn't as confident as before. "I think there's more to this story." "Of course there is," I said. "But you never cared about my story before, so why start now?" Aunt Margaret cleared her throat, pressing a hand to her chest, as if composing herself. "Alice, dear, I think we've had quite enough theatrics for one evening. This is a family reunion, not a business meeting." I gave her a slow, knowing smile. "Funny, you didn't seem to mind when Zach was making his business announcement." A few of my more distant cousins glanced at each other. They could see it now. The way Aunt Margaret had no problem when Zach was the center of attention, but she did when it was me. Aunt Margaret's mouth pressed into a thin line. Zach ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "All right, fine. Let's assume, for a second, that what you're saying is true." "Oh, it's true," I said. His jaw tightened. "How?" I let out a small sigh, leaning back in my chair. "You want the whole story, Zach? Fine. Let's talk about what happened after you all threw me away." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Uncle Henry frowned. "No one threw you away, Alice." I turned to him, my voice steady. "You didn't even fight for me to have a single penny from my father's estate." Silence. He didn't deny it. Because he couldn't. Aunt Margaret pursed her lips, as if preparing a carefully curated response. "It was a difficult time for everyone." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Difficult for everyone? That's interesting. Because while the rest of you were busy splitting up my father's assets, I was busy figuring out how to survive." Eric, who had always been the only one who never turned on me, sighed and ran a hand over his face. "Jesus, Alice." I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He was the only one I had ever considered family after everything that happened. I turned my attention back to Zach. "You want to know how I did it? Here's how." I set my glass down, my fingers lightly tracing the rim. "When I left Charleston, I had nothing. No money. No safety net. Just a duffel bag and enough anger to burn this entire city down." Zach folded his arms, but I could tell he was listening. They all were. "For months, I worked dead-end jobs just to make rent. I took whatever I could find: bartending, waiting tables, even cleaning hotel rooms." Aunt Margaret winced at that. She didn't like the image of a Harrington scrubbing floors. I smiled at her reaction and continued. "But here's the thing. I paid attention. I watched the way businesses ran, the way money moved. I started learning about real estate, how to spot an undervalued property, how to flip it for profit. I studied at night, worked during the day, and little by little, I built something from nothing." I let my words sink in before adding, "Something none of you thought I was capable of." Aunt Margaret, looking suddenly weary, lifted her glass to her lips, but her hand was trembling. Zach, still in denial, shook his head. "So what? You made a few good investments, and suddenly you think you belong at the table with the rest of us?" I let out a breath. "You still don't get it, do you?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a sleek, black leather folder. I slid it across the table toward him. He hesitated, eyeing it suspiciously. "Go on," I said. "Open it." His fingers curled around the edge of the folder, and as soon as he flipped it open, his expression completely changed. His mouth parted slightly. His eyes flicked across the documents inside, scanning the ownership records, the financial statements, the official Harrington Realty letterhead. His skin went pale. Aunt Margaret leaned forward slightly, her curiosity overpowering her pride. "What is it?" Zach's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "She's not lying." Aunt Margaret's breath hitched. That can't be." Zach lifted his eyes to me. You own multiple hotels?" "Among other things." I could see the exact moment the realization hit them. I wasn't just staying in the penthouse. I wasn't just an investor. I was the owner. The entire power structure of the family had shifted in a single night. Aunt Margaret inhaled sharply, setting down her drink as though it suddenly didn't taste as good. Uncle Henry rubbed his temple, his expression unreadable. Somewhere down the table, one of my cousins whispered, "Holy SHD." Zach looked almost nauseous. He had spent months negotiating to acquire this hotel, walking around with the smug confidence that he was about to expand the family's empire. And now? He was sitting across from the real owner. I leaned forward slightly. "You should probably talk to your investors, Zach. They're about to lose a lot of money." His nostrils flared. "You think this is funny?" I tilted my head. "You think I thought it was funny when you all left me with nothing?" Silence. Complete, heavy silence. Zach exhaled through his nose, his fists clenching at his sides. Aunt Margaret, clearly realizing the damage this night had done, lifted her chin and tried to regain control. "Well," she said carefully, her voice strained but steady. "It seems we have a lot to discuss." I let out a soft, almost amused breath. "Oh, Aunt Margaret," I murmured. She blinked at me, wary. I gave her a slow, deliberate smile. "You have no idea what's coming next." The The silence stretched unbearably across the table. Aunt Margaret, for the first time in her perfectly controlled life, didn't know what to say. Zach looked like he was one wrong word away from snapping. Uncle Henry, usually composed and unreadable, was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I let the tension hang there, let them sit in the weight of what they had just learned. Because this wasn't just a shift in family dynamics. This was a reckoning. For years, they had treated me like I was nothing. Like I was a disgrace, an embarrassment, a failed Harrington. Now, the very thing they prided themselves on, power, wealth, control, belonged to me. Aunt Margaret recovered first, straightening in her chair, her hands folding neatly on the table, as if she could somehow pretend she was still the one in control. "Alice, dear," she began, her voice smooth but tight with strain, "I think it would be best if I held up a hand." "Stop." Her eyes flickered, just for a second. Surprise. Because I had never interrupted her before. I had never spoken to her, or to any of them, like I was the one calling the shots. I wasn't the desperate girl they had pushed aside anymore. And they were finally starting to realize it. Zach let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head. "So what's your plan here, Alice? You show up after all these years, throw this in our faces, and then what? Expect us to bow at your feet?" I smiled. "I expect you to remember this moment." His lips pressed into a thin, furious line. "Because for the past decade," I continued, "I was the one no one cared to check on. No one called. No one offered help. Not even when I was struggling to eat." Aunt Margaret inhaled sharply, as if the thought of one of her own going hungry was too distasteful to bear. "Good. Let her sit with it. While you all played gatekeepers of wealth and status, I was building something better. And now?" I leaned forward slightly. "Now, I don't need your acceptance. I don't need your money. I don't need any of you." Zach scoffed. "What? So you came back just to rub it in our faces?" I tilted my head. "Does that bother you?" His jaw clenched. Aunt Margaret, still trying to salvage her dignity, forced another tight-lipped smile. "Alice, dear, let's not be so hostile. We're family." Eric coughed loudly into his fist, muttering, "Could have fooled me." I barely held back a laugh. Family. Now she wanted to play the family card? I could still remember how, after my father's funeral, she had spoken to me in that same clipped, condescending tone. "You'll be fine, dear. But without any assets, you should start thinking realistically about your future. I hear there are plenty of good secretarial jobs in Atlanta." I had been grieving, lost, and she had written me off like I was a burden to be discarded. I met her gaze head on. "I wasn't family when I needed you most." Her face paled. Uncle Henry sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. "Look, Alice, no one's denying that mistakes were made." "Mistakes?" That was a HLL of a way to describe what they did. Eric let out a low chuckle. "Mistakes? That's what we're calling it now?" Henry shot him a warning look. I didn't let him change the subject. "Here's the difference between us, Uncle Henry," I said, voice calm. "I don't forget who was there for me when I had nothing. And I sure as HLL don't forget who turned their backs." A heavy silence followed. Zach drummed his fingers against the table, his expression calculating. "Fine. So you made it big. Good for you. But let's talk about something real." I arched an eyebrow. "Go on." His lips curled into something sharp, cunning. "Business is business, Alice. And in this business, people don't get to the top alone. Sooner or later, you'll need allies. Partnerships." I could already see where this was going. "You think I need you," I said flatly. "I think," he said smoothly, "that a reunion could be beneficial for both sides." Aunt Margaret perked up at that. Of course she did. Now they saw my value. Now I was worth something. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. "You're talking about a business partnership." "I'm talking about fixing old wounds," he said with mock sincerity. "Keeping things in the family." I almost laughed. Unbelievable. They had discarded me like garbage when I was at my lowest. And now that I had power, real, tangible power, they wanted me back in the fold. I rested my chin on my hand. "Let me get this straight. You ignored me for a decade, left me with nothing, treated me like I didn't exist." Aunt Margaret opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "Don't interrupt me." Her mouth snapped shut. I turned back to Zach. "And now, you want me to just forgive all of that?" He shrugged, casual. "It's just business." I let out a slow exhale. "You know what's funny, Zach?" His eyebrow twitched. "What?" "I spent years thinking I wasn't good enough for this family. That I wasn't successful enough, wealthy enough, powerful enough to matter in your world." Zach didn't respond. I smiled. "And now, you're the one who needs me." His expression darkened. Aunt Margaret cleared her throat delicately. "Alice, darling, we could all benefit from putting the past behind us." I turned my gaze to her. "You want to put the past behind us?" "Yes," she said quickly, sensing an opening. "You've made your point. You've proven yourself. Now, we can move forward." I nodded slowly. Then, I picked up my wine glass, swirled the deep red liquid, and took a slow, deliberate sip. When I set it down, I looked her dead in the eye and said, "No." The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band. Aunt Margaret blinked rapidly. I beg your pardon?" I tilted my head. "You heard me." A few of my younger cousins gasped quietly. Eric muttered under his breath, "Oh my God. This is the best night of my life." Zach clenched his jaw. "Alice, be rational." I smirked. "Oh, I'm being very rational." He inhaled sharply through his nose, his entire body brimming with frustration. You're making a mistake. I picked up my glass again, taking another sip. No, Zach. You did. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Aunt Margaret clutched at her pearl necklace like she was about to faint. Zach looked like he wanted to flip the entire table over. And I just smiled. Because this was only the beginning. Zach sat there, his face frozen in stunned disbelief. Aunt Margaret clutched at her pearls, her lips parting slightly as if she were struggling to form words. Uncle Henry leaned back, rubbing his temples, already realizing there was no salvaging this night. They thought they could erase me, rewrite history, and now, they were scrambling to adjust to a reality where I wasn't just an afterthought, I was the one in control. I took a deep breath, feeling something I hadn't in years. Power. Not just power in wealth or status, but power in knowing they couldn't touch me anymore. That nothing they said or did could ever make me feel small again. I tapped a single finger against the rim of my glass, letting the silence stretch just a little longer before I finally spoke. I'm not here to make peace. Zach's nostrils flared. Alice, I held up a hand. I let you talk. Now it's my turn. He shut his mouth, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might crack a tooth. I leaned forward slightly, letting my gaze drift over each of them, the family that had so easily discarded me, the ones who had looked at me like I was nothing the last time we were in a room together. I spent years thinking about what I would say to you if I ever got the chance. I admitted, my voice calm but firm. Years wondering if I'd ever be able to prove to you that I wasn't the failure you thought I was. I tilted my head, but then I realized something. Zach's brow furrowed, but Aunt Margaret was already bracing herself. I don't need to prove anything to you. Aunt Margaret exhaled sharply. Alice, dear, we understand you're upset, but holding on to resentment isn't healthy. Let's be civil. I laughed under my breath. Civil? You want civility after the way you treated me? She swallowed, her face tightening. We thought we were doing what was best for the family. There it was. That same self-righteous excuse. I shook my head, a slow, knowing smile creeping onto my lips. No, you did what was best for yourselves. Aunt Margaret looked away. I didn't let her off the hook. You only see me as valuable now that I have something you want. But here's the thing. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping just enough to make sure every word landed. I don't forgive you. Her breath hitched. Uncle Henry let out a long sigh, rubbing his face. All right, Alice. You've made your point. Now let's discuss how we move forward. I smiled. We don't. Zach straightened. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious. His hands curled into fists. You're going to throw away a chance to fix this family over some petty grudge? I tilted my head. It's not petty. It's a lesson. I reached into my purse, pulling out another sleek, black folder. Zach stared at it like it was a ticking BMB. I slid it across the table. Slowly, cautiously, he opened it. His eyes flicked across the pages, his face shifting from suspicious to confused to horrified. Aunt Margaret leaned in, snatching the papers from his hands. She read the first few lines, and suddenly, her breath shook. What is this? She whispered. Uncle Henry, frowning, took the papers from her and read them himself. His expression turned ashen. Zach, voice tight, finally forced out. Where did you get this? I took my time, sipping my wine before answering. It wasn't hard, because the folder contained every single financial misstep they had made in the last 5 years. The bad investments, the questionable loans, the risky deals Zach had brokered in a desperate attempt to expand. Deals he had been planning to fix by acquiring this hotel. Deals that were now dead in the water. Eric let out a low whistle. Damn, you really came prepared. I turned to Zach, watching as the arrogance drained from his face. You needed this hotel to cover your losses, I said. You needed me to be desperate enough to sell. Aunt Margaret's hand trembled as she clutched the folder. Alice, if this gets out, it's already out. Her head snapped up. Uncle Henry's face went completely pale. Zach looked like he wanted to flip the entire table over. You're bluffing. I smirked. Am I? They all knew I wasn't. Because I wasn't just wealthy. I was connected. And the second those financial records hit the right hands, their precious Harrington family, named the name they had protected at all costs, would be dragged through the mud. Aunt Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, swallowing thickly. Alice, please. We can work something out. I arched an eyebrow. Now she was begging? I already have worked something out, I said. You and Zach are going to sign over every single share of the remaining Harrington properties. To me. Zach slammed his fist against the table. Like HLL we will. I smiled. Then I'll let the media have a field day with what's in that folder. His face went red with rage. Aunt Margaret's lips parted, her fingers gripping the papers so tightly they crinkled. You can't do this, she whispered. I can, I said. And I am. Uncle Henry exhaled shakily. If we do this, the family loses everything. I held his gaze. Not everything. Just what you stole from me. Aunt Margaret shuddered. Zach looked sick. Eric? Eric was grinning. Aunt Margaret's voice trembled as she finally choked out. And if we sign? I picked up my wine glass, taking my time before answering. If you sign, I'll make sure this never sees the light of day. You'll retire comfortably, out of the public eye. No scandal. No disgrace. Zach gritted his teeth. You're going to ruin us. I took another sip of wine. Then, I set my glass down, wiped my lips with a napkin, and gave him a slow, satisfied smile. No, Zach. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. You ruined yourselves. A heavy, unbearable silence fell over the room. Then, slowly, reluctantly, Aunt Margaret picked up a pen. Her fingers shook as she signed the papers. Uncle Henry followed. And finally, with barely concealed rage, Zach scrawled his name across the contract. Eric let out a low, appreciative whistle. Damn, Alice. That was beautiful. I folded the papers neatly, tucking them into my purse. Then, I stood, smoothing out my dress. I turned to Aunt Margaret, Zach, and Uncle Henry, the people who had once destroyed me. And then, with one last victorious smile, I said, enjoy your retirement. And with that, I walked away. I didn't look back, because I never needed to. And for the first time in my life, I was finally free.